Hello everyone and welcome to another podcast from Lou and Lilja. This time we are talking to Kevin Quigley, who's written several books about King and his work, and we are doing a review of In the Tall Grass. That might go against what some of you think of the story, so check it out and comment on it afterwards. Besides that, we also have the news and questions, so welcome.
Welcome, welcome. Do not fear the door that lies before you. We will protect you. We are your guides, Hans and Lou, and we will give you the latest in Stephen King news. But before we do so, you must prove yourself worthy. You must open the door and join us in the death room.
And in this week's news, we have some paperback news. Both in the UK and the US, the trade paperbacks of 11/22/63 is out, and a smaller paperback will be out in the States in October. And the latest book, Wind Through the Keyhole, will be out in November in paperback. So check for those if you haven't bought them already.
And in movie news, Mark Pavia has turned in his script for The Reaper's Image, which is a four-story anthology for his Stephen King movie, for Stephen King's review and approval, and he's waiting to hear back on that. So hopefully that will happen quickly. I imagine it will. Stephen King is usually pretty generous with those types of things. So hopefully that means that Mr. Pavia will be able to start shooting that movie soon.
Yeah, it should be interesting to see what he can do with that one.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, we have two shorter stories, or really short books, whichever you prefer to call it, coming out. And one is In the Tall Grass, we reviewed in this podcast. This is being released as an ebook and on CD this October. So if you didn't get it when it was released in Esquire, this is your chance to get it.
And the second release is the story that Stephen King wrote with his baseball co-writer, and this one's called A Face in the Crowd, and you can follow the link from Lily's site and listen to a small excerpt from the story. And from what I just listened to it before we did the podcast, then I'm definitely intrigued as to where that story is going to go. It's a great premise for a story, so I'm really looking forward to hear what he does with it.
Yeah, and I think this one will be more a story where the baseball elements are just backgrounds and not like Fateful that I wrote earlier. It was very much about baseball.
Yep.
So even us foreigner can follow that one. And that one is released on August 21st, so it's just a day or so away. Yeah.
Cool. And the last piece of news, Lilja?
Yes, I am having a Stephen King book challenge on my site. And for those of you who haven't already checked it out, it's basically a tournament between all King's books where I have randomly paired them up 2 and 2. And for each day now, for a couple of days, I have released 2 pairs, which you can vote for one of each in each pair. And the book that gets the most votes are moving on to the second round and will meet the winner from the other pair, and so on, until we have one final book that has beaten them all. So that could be interesting to check out if you haven't done already.
Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to compare that list against the recent top 100 book poll that we ran to see how the books stack up against one another, doing it in an elimination style.
Yeah. So this
process.
Could be some interesting winners depending on who they are facing.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they are all randomly selected, so I haven't done any personal choices. They are all randomly selected pairs, if anyone was wondering.
Very good.
Yeah.
Alrighty. So that's the news for this segment. Thanks very much for tuning in.
Okay, we're back, and we have Kevin Quigley with us, fellow writer about Stephen King. Hello, Kev.
Hi, guys.
How are you?
Hello. Hey, Kev.
Good. How are you?
Fine. So, you are writing books about Stephen King. How did that start?
Okay, so it started in 2009. I got Brian Freeman contacted me regarding helping work on the Stephen King movie trivia book. And what was sort of lucky at the time, lucky in retrospect, I had just been laid off from my job, and I was looking for something to do while I looked for another job. And Brian just dropped this on my lap and said, "Hey, do you want to help write these trivia questions?" So I said, "Great, that'd be terrific," and it filled up my time. He discovered me through my website, Charnel House, and he liked the reviews that I had written on that site and thought I could do well writing a book about King. And I've been sort of writing about King since high school, so it was a really nice fit. So that's how things got started.
What was your first book about King?
So that was the first one I finished, but the first one that was published called Chart of Darkness. And it's a book that I've been wanting to write for a really long time, but I didn't really have the impetus to do it because I either didn't have time or I was working on other stuff. It is a book about Stephen King and the bestseller list. I'd read this book once called the #1 New York Times bestseller. I became obsessed with it, partially because Stephen King had the most #1 bestsellers ever in the history of the chart. So I thought that was really interesting. So I thought it would be neat to look at the history of him on the charts and why certain books became #1, why certain things didn't become #1, what happened to the books that didn't. Like the Christine only went to #3, which I thought was really interesting. Rose Madder only went to #2. One of these other little bits of trivia was Needful Things came out around the same time as a bunch of other writers published big novels. And so all these people had these books, and they all should have been #1, but the sequel to Gone with the Wind had come out a week before, so none of them got to the #1 spot, including Needful Things. So I thought that was like an interesting little trivia bit, and I thought other people might find that fascinating. So yeah, that was my first one published through Cemetery Dance.
Sounds like a book that required quite some research.
Oh yes, I was. This is before I knew how to use the internet to research. I use, I mean, to go to newspaper archives. So what I actually did was I live in Boston, so I went to the Boston Public Library every single day and looked through microfiche and actual newspapers. And by the end of the book, I was able to actually use their database, but I didn't have access at the beginning. So it was a lot of effort, a lot of work to do, but it was a lot of fun.
Amazing. And after that one, you felt you wanted to continue writing about King?
Yeah. So what Cemetery Dance does is they have these little chapter books that they sometimes give away with like grab bags and that type of thing. So they need people to write those, and sometimes they have fiction written by people. But they knew I liked writing about King, and as I started to discover, there's a lot of avenues to write about King. It's not just the bestsellers. So the next time I did one, it was a book called Wetware, which is about Stephen King and technology. And so it goes through the history of like the video games that were based on King's books in the early 80s, all the way up to on Kindle and Mile 81 on ebook. So that was the first one. They liked that one so much they did it as a regular chapter book, and then they actually put it up for sale, Cemetery Dance. So that was my first book for sale from them. And then I did a bunch of others. I did one on audiobooks called Blood in Your Ears. I did two books actually, on people who wrote about King, like George Beam and Stephen Spignesi and Michael Collins and everyone. And I got to do interviews with them all. And that was called Ink in the Veins. And I also did a book on King comic books. A lot of people know his Creep Show, and they know a little bit about American Vampire, which is sort of recent. But he's been doing a lot of comic book stuff all through the years. It's just sort of been underground. So I did a book called Drawn into Darkness. And that came out, I think, last year. And that was another chapter book. And now all those came out on ebook, so now you can actually go and buy those and read them on iPad or Kindle.
Yeah, one thing that I get very impressed with by your book is that you always seems to find a new angle to King works. When you think every aspect has been covered in either a book or on a web page or something, and you seems to find a new angle to stuff all the time and write about. How do you find all these angles to write about, new angles?
Well, I take my cues from a lot of the books that came out from Starmont House and Borgo Press in the 80s. They released like 7 books on King back then, and I always find it really interesting because you could take a look at King as a writer and look at his writing qualitatively. Then you could look at him as a best-selling writer, so you can take a look that way. He's so prolific, you can find him as like a pop culture icon, and as a literary writer, which he is both. And then he does stuff like he never stays in one box. He's got all these avenues. So you could do a whole book about his comics. You can do a whole book about his audiobooks. That was one of the most fascinating things, because most people, there's a book and then there's an audiobook and it's nothing major. But with King, he published a whole book in just audio at one point, and he's lent his voice to several audiobooks, like Sarah Vowell's Assassination Vacation. He did the audio reading of Tabitha King's One-on-One, and it's fascinating to go back and see that he's done all this different stuff, and you can attack it from different angles, and you can look at his career from different angles and never come up with the same exact thing. I just find it so interesting that he's been such a pop culture icon and a writer for so long, and there's never a shortage of anything to write about him.
Yeah. When you write a book, because being so productive as King is, books about him have a tendency to get outdated pretty quickly. When you write a book, like for example about audiobooks, and it's done, do you keep tracks of every audiobooks that's released after that to be able to make updated version?
Yeah, so what I'll do is have my website, Charnel House, and I'll try to get it in as I'm keeping that updated for later versions of the book. Never when they're going to want a re-release of the book or when they're going to want a new edition. So I always try to keep things going. Unfortunately, because there's so many, I've now written so many books about King, it's hard to keep track of. So, but because I love research so much, I'm actually looking forward to the day where they're like, hey, we need a new edition of Chart of Darkness. And so I'm looking forward to the day that I can go back and like gut my whole book, change stuff, move stuff around, and add new stuff. I love the idea of expansion like that. Research has been a big. I used to hate research in high school. I got a lot of bad grades for them saying your book was written, your paper was written really well, but you're not showing any research. And so now I love research. So I guess pay attention in school, kids.
Yeah. When you get a new book by King, can you read it relaxed, or do you find yourself taking notes for upcoming projects?
Well, I've never read a King book relaxed. I don't take notes on the first read, but I have this ritual where I go there the day it comes out and I put my money down and I take the morning off of work. It's a whole thing, and like I get into it and I almost attack a new Stephen King book like I'm attacking Sparta or something. I just get so into it, and only like halfway through the book do I sort of start to unwind and let the story sort of seep into me. And that's when I start thinking, well, okay, here's a connection to another book, and here's how I could write about this eventually. But it's all in the back of my brain. The forefront of my brain is only thinking about the story and only enjoying the work. That's the first time I go into it. And then when I reread it, then I start thinking of ways to take notes and how it's going to affect his career and how it's doing all the stuff with the charts. So yeah, the first read is not relaxed, but it's all story.
So what are you working on now about King?
I am working on a couple of books about King. There's one coming out soon, actually, and it's about limited editions. It's called Stephen King Limited, and there has never been a narrative book about Stephen King limited editions. It's always been, anytime anybody's done a book about limited editions, it's all been lists and pictures, and that's great. But I thought it would be fun to take a look at a history and people can say, oh, this is how this came about. This is how this started. This is how it kept going on. Here's some weird stuff that went on. I discovered a lot of really interesting stuff about small presses that people are going to find interesting. So that's what I'm working on now. I'm also working on a book called A Good Story and Good Words, The Worlds of Stephen King, which is a compilation volume of all the chapbooks that I've done on King, plus a lot of new content. All my Stephen King book reviews are in there. There is a history of Stephen King and his career before Carrie. So all the fiction he published, all the nonfiction he published, all the poetry he published before Carrie came out, that's in like a timeline at the beginning of the book, and then I launch into the reviews. It's a really big project, and that's going to be coming out at some point in 2014 or 2013. Sorry.
Cool. If you would recommend one book about Stephen King to someone who wants to know more about Stephen King, which book would that be?
Oh boy.
You had to know that question was coming.
I did know that. Discounting my books, because my books are obviously the best.
Of course.
I can't narrow down to one. I have to go with three. So the Stephen King Companion by George Beam is a really great book to jump into to learn about King. When I was first getting into King, I bought that, and it helped me to understand a lot more about him and about his writing, and it encouraged me to read more. The second one is, of course, Stephen King Encyclopedia by Stephen Spignesi, which is an exhaustive encyclopedic work about his stuff. And it has all these interviews. It lists every person, place, and thing in every Stephen King book, from Carrie to The Wastelands. And it's a fantastic book. And then, of course, The Art of Darkness by Douglas Winter. It's only current through the late 80s, but it was the first book about King, and it's so well written, and it's he had all this access to King that later writers about King don't have. And I highly, highly recommend any reader of King read that.
Yeah. Speaking of access to King, have you gotten any comments from King, or has he helped in any way?
Sadly, no. I don't know if he's read my books. I don't know if he's aware of them. He's met me a couple times, but that's only for book signings.
Yep.
No, I literally have no idea if he's read any of my stuff. I hope he has. I think that, he's published things through Cemetery Dance, and I published things through Cemetery Dance, so the hope is that he's seen some of it. But, you never know. And if he has a negative opinion about it, I kind of don't want to know. So...
Yeah,
I prefer to think that he likes my stuff. So let's hope.
I'm sure he do. So, and you have written other books as well that hasn't anything to do with Stephen King.
I started off my life. I've always wanted to be a writer, and started off as a film writer. The Stephen King stuff only came a little later. So I've been writing stories, poems, and novels since I was 12. So recently, Cemetery Dance decided to take a chance on my fiction, and so they just published which is a Steinbeck quote that has 12 of my short stories. And that's published an ebook and published up, which is a poetry, and it's look at the cover. I was very impressed with there's a Beach Boys album called Surf's Up, and the title brings to mind like a lot of fun Beach Boys, Fun in the Sun type stuff. And the cover is this old painting, and it's dreary and sad and depressing, and I love that juxtaposition. So most of my poems are violent and dark and upsetting, and I thought that it would be cool to have that title. So those are out now for Cemetery Dance ebook.
And you are also working on another novel, right?
Right. I'm currently I just finished writing a novel called I'm on Fire. And it's a novel actually I wrote in 1999, and for the first time, and it was my second novel, and I've written about 17 at this point. And as I discovered, my 23-year-old writing, vastly different from my 37-year-old writing, not as good, I think, especially for a second novel. So I went through and I gutted the book. I rewrote the whole thing. I added a character. I took away a character, and I changed the ending, changed the beginning. It's a little bit like The Stand, but much smaller and less apocalyptic. So that will hopefully be coming out I'm going to be having some people beta read it right now, and that will, I think, be coming out from Cemetery Dance either later this fall or this winter.
Cool. And which book are you most happy with? Your own novel or your books about Stephen King?
My novel. I love my books about Stephen King, and I think most of it taught me how to research, and it taught me how to love research. All those books, and I love them. But fiction is always going to be my first passion, and I will never stop loving creating new worlds. The cool thing about writing about King is that he's done all the work for you. It's a lot scarier to jump into a novel of your own and discover the things that are inside you and how you see the world and put that together in something creative, and I think that's a lot more interesting.
Yeah. So, Lou, do you have anything to add?
Well, you've done a very, very thorough job. I'd just echo some of your sentiment that I found your books very interesting about King because you covered areas that normally don't get covered by his biographies. And like you said, you have a book of The Art of Darkness where you talk about his bestsellers. You have the wetware with the experimental publishing. The one that I got the most kick out of, though, is your book about other Stephen King writers. So it's kind of like I'm looking into a mirror and a series of mirrors that keep going down, down, down. We've talked about writers that write about Stephen King, and now you wrote about writers that write about Stephen King. So I got
what I really want
I got quite the kick out of that.
I want somebody to write a book about that book. So
exactly, that's the next level.
very interesting to write that. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I just want to mention for our listeners that all of these ebooks are available on Cemetery Dance, and they're all probably around, 40, 50 pages each?
So they're books, yeah, about 50 pages, and you can get them on, you can get them directly through Cemetery Dance, or you can get them on Amazon for your Kindle, or the iBook store, or on Nook.
Mm-hmm. And the great thing is these things, they're only a couple of bucks a pop. So for anybody out there that just wants to find out more about King, these are great supplements to the larger, more established biographies that you mentioned a couple of them off the top. One of the ones that I found very interesting was your Blood in the Ears. And you listed the top 10 Stephen King audio adaptations. And
yes.
I will go through the list quickly. Okay. Number 10 is Christine. Number 9 is The Mist. Number 8 is The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. Number 7 is Carrie. 6 is Building Bridges. 5 is Different Seasons. 4 is Misery. 3 is The Green Mile. 2 is On Writing. And 1 is Dolores Claiborne. So my question to you, Kevin.
Yes.
My question to you is, where is Bag of Bones?
So, okay.
Is that my all-time favorite Stephen King audio?
I love Bag of Bones. Don't get me wrong. I think Bag of Bones is definitely one of his best. But what I wanted to do with the top 10 is try to make it so I'm only really representing one reader. One like a unique reader for every book, and I didn't want to fill the whole thing up with books read by Stephen King. So I decided to take the best of the Stephen King books read by him, and On Writing was just a little bit more than Bag of Bones, but I love Bag of Bones. Don't get me wrong.
Okay. Okay, I'll let you on. I was just like,
no, it is. It's a little because I sat there and I was like, maybe I should do a top 11 list. Because Bag of Bones is so good, but because a lot of it's about writing, I thought that On Writing covered a lot of that same ground. So, agreed.
Okay. All right. We're still friends. Very good.
Okay.
I think that's it. I think that's it for me. I just want to say again to everybody out there, if you're looking for some very in-depth and at the same time not too expensive additions to the Stephen King universe, I highly recommend Kevin's books to you.
Definitely.
Thank you, guys.
I will put a link from my site where you listen to this podcast, so you can just click the link and upload them to your iPod and start reading.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Very nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you guys as well.
Thank you for taking the time, Kevin.
I hope to talk to you again soon.
Your novel.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is great. What's our job? We'd like drive around and pick up stiffs or what?
It's time for reviews from The Night Shift.
Stephen King has a new short story published in Esquire, June, July, and August issue. It's called In the Tall Grass, and he wrote this with his son, Joe Hill. And part 2 has just been released, and we have read it, and we are going to talk a bit about it. For those who haven't read it, you should probably hold on listening to this because there are going to be spoilers. So, did you read it all in one, or did you read it as it was released?
I did it both ways. Because
just to be safe.
I had an interesting experience when I read the first part and then waited a month for the next part to come out. But I didn't reread the first part, so I just read the second part, and I really didn't like the second part that much compared to the first part. So I thought, it must be because I'm not remembering exactly what happened in the first part. So then I went back and read both parts together just before we podcasted, and it worked a lot better for me when I did it that way.
Okay. I read them as they were released only, so I'm able to go back and read them back to back again.
And what did you think of it?
I have the same feeling as you did. Maybe we should do a short synopsis for it first, just if you haven't read it and still want to talk about it. It's about brother and sister, Becky and Cal, who is traveling. Becky is pregnant and is about to give her baby up for adoption. As they are taking a break, getting out of the car, get some fresh air, they hear people calling from a field with very, very tall grass and calling that they are lost in the grass and can't find a way back. So they decide to help them and go out in the grass, and soon they find themselves lost in the grass as well. And whichever way they go, they are either getting further away from each other or in the wrong direction, or something is fishy about the grass, and soon they are lost as well. So that's the short synopsis for it. And in the first part, we get the backstory. They are getting lost in the grass, and they hear other people shouting that they're lost and trying to find each other. And I that part I really enjoyed. It was mystic, and you didn't really know what was going on, and how could they walk to the road, but they ended up getting further away from the road. So that was a good part, I think. Then in the second part, I think the tone of the story changed from being mystic when Becky finds this man that has been shouting out to them, telling them he's lost in the grass. And it turns out there's a mystic rock, and he eats his wife and stuff like that. I think it changed in a direction that I didn't really understand why. Did you feel the same way?
Yeah, I had the same issue even on reread. I guess, like you said, the first half of the story is such a great setup. You have this brother and sister who, I don't know if they set it up this way so that it was easier for both Stephen King and Joe Hill to write, but they're basically two peas in a pod, and for all purposes, they might as well be twins. So that's to allow the viewpoint to shift without too much of a difference in the characters. And I think that, for me, that's one of the problems, is that the story keeps shifting between Cal and Becky's perspective. I think for short stories, I much prefer if it stays with one person. And like in the Long Walk, which we just talked about recently, that story is told totally through one person's perspective, which is Peter Garrity, or Ray Garrity. But here it keeps flipping between the brother and sister, and I don't really like that as much. And as you said, the whole concept of walking it into a field of grass and not being able to get out is really scary, but it plays off like one of those monster movies where it's what you think is behind the door is usually much scarier than what's behind the door, and that's what happens in this story for me as well.
Yeah, and I didn't really understand why. That's I think that was my biggest problem. I mean, obviously the man went insane by being in the grass, but then you have this rock that affects people. It's hot, it's burning them. They are going crazy by touching it, and there's cannibalism. I didn't really understand why. That I think that was my biggest problem with the story. If they had explained a little bit more why things happened, it might have been better. But I'm not sure. I think the second part of it was very weak, I think.
Okay. Yeah, you should reread it, and then next week when we do the news, we can do like a touch up and add it in. But just to see if it changes your mind at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's the first part was more suspense, and like you say, the second part was more slasher.
Yeah.
It just turned into a gross out. And for myself, that kind of story doesn't really interest me anymore. And I really want to see how characters react in these kind of situations. And really, neither one of them, the brother or sister, they're just just nothing happens with them. They're gone, and that's it. So it's not satisfying from that perspective, because the premise was so great. And it's interesting, if this had been released all at once, maybe we wouldn't be having these issues. But I think for this story, it actually hurt it quite a bit that they released it in two parts.
Yeah, I agree. The expectations after reading the first part was pretty high.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What was your thoughts about the stone and why they started eating each other? And
it's like you said, it's never explained, and because the story is so short, it's just a MacGuffin. It's not really important to the story because it's just there to give a reason as to why these people start acting this way. But as to why it makes people act that way, that's not explained, and so that's why it's unsatisfying as a story for me.
Yeah. It would be very interesting to hear how the story was written, because for me, part 1 and part 2 were quite different. So for me, it would be possible that Stephen King wrote the first part and Joe Hill the second part, or the other way around. But they were so different that they could have been written by two different people.
Yeah. No matter what you say here, you're going to get fans of either writer. You're going to get in trouble for it because.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. My initial reaction is that Stephen King wrote the first half and Joe Hill the second half, and I love Joe Hill's writing as well. It was just a premise that was set up that just didn't go in any new direction. I guess, like you said, you don't understand it, and it's a pretty. In the end, it just ends up being a pretty generic horror story with nothing new or unique about it to make it stand out from countless other stories of this type.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I don't think part 1 was written by one of them and part 2 was written by the other. I think they wrote the entire story together. So I don't want to point fingers to anyone, but it's surprising to me that the tone of the stories, the tone of the different parts were so different. It could have been 2 different stories if they could have been released like 2 different stories. The second would have been very confusing. I agree too, but they could have been 2 different stories and not 2 parts of one story, and that's a bit strange to me.
Yeah, it's a bit jarring, definitely. But I agree with you. I don't think they structured that way, because there's bits and pieces in the second story I'm sure Stephen King wrote, because there's just certain expressions that he uses that I've seen in other stories. So definitely feeling of arbitrarily, we could say every time we see like they have double bars in the story, you could say that's when they switched writers. But I mean, there's one section that's just one line, so I don't know if that works or not.
Yeah, and I don't know how they work. Maybe they were sitting at the kitchen table and talked the story through together and made it up, and then maybe one of them just wrote it on the computer. I don't know how they work. Maybe they discuss the story from start to end to get it, and then maybe they didn't just write some part and send it to the other, and he wrote, and we don't know how they did it.
Yeah.
So that would be interesting. If anyone has read anything about that, please tell us. That would be interesting to find out.
And I don't think they'll ever reveal how they wrote it, but
yeah,
I had high expectations after the first part, and I was let down with the second part. So
yeah, I feel exactly the same way. The first part was extremely well told, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that helped making me disappointed in the second part, because you had such a high expectation from reading the first part. So then when it didn't fulfill those expectations, I think you get extra disappointed in it.
Yeah. And that's one of the inherent problems or obstacles that horror writers have, is the setup is often very much more interesting than the payoff. And the story is a good example of that.
Yeah. So where would you put this in a scale from 1 to 10?
I'd probably give it a 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would land somewhere between 5 and 6, maybe.
Well, the first half was good, so you have to be higher than 5.
Yeah, exactly. the first half I would probably put like a 9.
An 8 or a 9, yeah.
And the second part probably 2, 3, maybe. I don't mind it being such a gross part, but I like to understand why, and this was completely
gratuitous.
Yeah, I didn't understand it, and I think that was the biggest problem for me.
Yeah. Well, if we never got feedback from our viewers before, I think we finally put out a review that's sure to generate some comments.
Yeah, and that would be great.
Yeah.
I would love to hear from. I bet there's a lot of people out there that explanations for why things happen that do in the second part, and I would love to hear them. So please.
Yeah, especially from people that liked the story, we would really hear what it is about it that you liked. I mean, I don't know if you're into zombie stuff and maybe The Walking Dead, but you love The Walking Dead, Hans, and this story's not doing it for you, so that's not really working either. But it's just not a story something that I would come back to ever again.
Yeah, and I think you're worse off than me, because I actually like gore and stuff. So that part I have no problem with, but as I said, it should have been explained better.
Right.
Why? Yeah.
Okay. Well, there you go, folks. That's our thoughts on In the Tall Grass, and we might be hiding in the tall grass depending on what people think of our review.
Never. We stand proud for our thoughts.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Very good. And now on to Marv's mailbag. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the latest Marv's mailbag. And we have some questions from our listeners. And first up, we have a question from Paul Atwood. And he asks us, what's your favorite Stephen King experience? Hans?
Well, that's actually an easy one. And I have 3 experiences that are my favorites. One is when I met King in London on the publishing party. And the other 2 are the interviews I did with him over the phone in 2007 and 2008. That's definitely my favorite experience with King.
Okay. My favorite experience, I've seen King twice, and the first time I saw him, he was in Canada, in Toronto, for a Publishers Award, and I cannot remember who interviewed him, but it was a young writer as well, and that was just a fantastic experience. I had always known from interviews that King seemed very relaxed and easygoing in front of a large crowd, and he was very, very open and funny and entertaining at that event that we attended, and I went with my brother and his son, and we all had a great time, and he made us laugh, and said if in a perfect world, Maine would be part of Canada. So that of course got the crowd all on his side in that. So that was definitely my favorite experience. I saw him a second time in Toronto a couple years later with David Cronenberg, and as much as it hurts me to say, Mr. Cronenberg was not a good interviewer, because he asked long rambling questions that just seemed to go off into the nether, which was too bad, because I was really hoping for some keen insights maybe into the Dead Zone movie that he did on Stephen King's book. But yeah, that one was still good, but the first one was definitely the highlight of my Stephen King favorite experiences.
Yeah. The next question is from Alex Callahan, and he wants to know what our favorite short stories are and why. And we have answered these questions quite some times. We'll have to ask you, Alex, to check out our earlier podcasts, and you will find the answer there. And the same goes for Monita Webb Grulke, sorry if I didn't pronounce that right, who asks if anyone ever asked him to talk about the sex scene in It. And we actually answered that question to some degree also in an earlier podcast. So check out the earlier ones and you'll find the answer there. So the next question is from Matthew Biddle. Which movie do you wish you could have been in? Do you have any favorite movie?
Well, I've said this several times on almost every podcast now, but my favorite movie and Stephen King movie just happens to be one and the same, and that's The Shawshank Redemption. So yeah, I don't know if I would have liked to play a prisoner or a guard in that movie, but yeah, I definitely would have. It would have been cool to have been an extra in that movie.
Yeah, I think I would have preferred to be in The Mist and be slaughtered by some horrible monster.
Yeah,
It would have been nice.
yeah. Or in Stand By Me with the lard-ass Logan scene.
Yeah.
That would have been fun too.
Yeah, that would have been great.
Yeah.
Yep.
Next question is from Grayson Still, and she asks, my mom would like to know if King would ever write an equine-based book. And while I know Stephen King has said many times that he would like to write a Western, which is really the only platform I could see him doing a horse-based book on, I don't know, like, if he hasn't done a Western by now, I don't know if he's ever going to do one. And I don't know, he's done books with animals, but usually dogs featuring prominently in them. So I really have no idea, Grayson. I'm sorry. You'll just have to tell your mother that, just keep hoping, and who knows? He's written many stories, and a horse is bound to come along sooner or later, I guess.
Yeah, I think about the Western. I think he said he tried to do one, but ended up with the cowboys falling in the what's it called? Where the pigs have
Yes.
food.
Yeah.
And pigs ate them. So I don't know how good a Western that would have been.
Yeah.
Last question is from Cecilia Duran, who wants to know what the next movie is based on the Stephen King book that's coming out. And the only one I think we know is the new Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anyone else coming up?
Not filming. I mean, there's talks of the 10 o'clock people and The Stand.
Yeah, that's right. 10 o'clock people is definitely happening, so that's right.
And The Dark Tower, of course, but The Stand and The Dark Tower have been up in the air for so long, and wasn't it being considered for a remake as well?
Yeah,
I think.
Two movies.
Two movies. So
yeah.
Carrie for sure, Cecile, but beyond that, and 10 o'clock people, but that's probably going to be almost a year after Carrie. So those are the next two to keep an eye out for. And as far as 11/22/63, I think there was talks about that one being made as a movie as well, but no firm details have been forthcoming since that initial speculation.
Yeah, I think it's one of those where the rights has been sold and someone is working on the script, but that really doesn't tell us much about when it's coming or who's in it or anything. So, yeah.
And that's the mailbag for this week. Once again, I want to thank everybody for sending in your questions. Don't be afraid to send those audio questions, and we're probably going to get a lot of questions or comments about our In the Tall Grass review. So we're looking forward to that as well.
I hope so. Yeah.
So there you go, folks. There's another Lilja and Lou podcast in the can. We're really curious to see what you think of our reactions to the In the Tall Grass story. And if that doesn't heat things up, then we've got Firestarter, the movie, on the schedule for our next podcast. As well, we'll be doing a review of the audio story Face in the Crowd that Stephen King wrote with Stuart Onan. But until then, Lilja, take us out.
Stay safe, but stay scared.